taping this, everybody, in case you're wondering what's going on here. There's the green light. Hey, good morning. This is the first September meeting for the League of Women Voters. It's great to get back here on such a nice, cool, sunny day. And if you can get around the roadblocks, why, I'm glad to see everybody here. Just wanted to welcome you to begin with. We have a speaker today that we are going to be really enjoying and learning a lot from. And first we have just a few announcements that I'm going to just highlight. This week there are a lot of things going on in Edina because we're celebrating our 125th anniversary, our quasquicentennial. And one of the highlights of this event is this week, Sunday, the League of Women Voters is participating along with other community groups for a historic house tour. You maybe saw some of the wonderful publicity that we've gotten. It's this week, Sunday, September 15th. And tickets are $15 in advance and $20 at the door. And outside at the reception desk, there are tickets available so you can rush over there and get your discounted tickets today if you'd like to. And it's from 1 until 5. The League is also having a school board meeting here at this site on the 24th, Tuesday the 24th, 7 o'clock until 8:30. And there are 9 candidates for the school board this time, so it should be an interesting meeting. So please come to that and be informed. In October, we're doing community on Thursday, October 10th, we'll be at the Edina Library, and this is going to be considering Edina's trash collection issue, which has been getting quite a bit of news lately, and something that'll be very worthwhile to see. And there'll be a Saturday on October 12th in the community room upstairs in this building. In November, we're going into Parks and Recreation, and there'll be 2 meetings on that in different places, and I'll be kind of discussing different things, and so that'll be something really good to see too. And I wanted to point out too, before we get into our speaker, there are some sheets out on the back out on the table in the back for the League members to sign up for the possibility of bringing refreshments for the different meetings, because generally when we have it at libraries or upstairs, then we can bring refreshments. The city policy is to not have anything here, so we couldn't do it today, unfortunately. So anyway, to get to the most important part, which is Jeff Narrabrook is the voter outreach director at the Office of Minnesota Secretary of State. And he's been involved in this voter outreach for a long time, worked for nonprofits originally, and then went in with the Secretary of State. So we would really like to applaud the fact that he came, and our own city clerk, Deb Mangan, is going to be here later to do a demonstration. You noticed her entrance here with her appliance. But Jeff's going to take questions at the end too. So, Jeff, thank you.
I think I got a mic on me here. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for coming out on a Thursday morning to learn about election reform. You are unique people. Not a lot of people would get up to do this, so we're grateful that you're here. I wanted to thank Kay and the City of Edina and Debbie for setting this up. We're going to go over today the things that happened in the last legislative session, talk a little bit about what's coming around the corner next year maybe, and then we're going to have a chance for Deb Magnan to show off some new equipment and answer other questions. I really like to have back and forth, so if there's please raise your hand really at any point would be my preference. I will restate your question because we're taping this, so I don't have a mic to pass around, but I like for people to ask questions as we go. A little bit more about my background. So I'm new to the Office of the Secretary of State, started there in July. Previous to that, I was working for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits doing similar work. So I was working with community organizations, helping them understand the voting process, how to engage their clients, their constituents in the voting process. I also was involved with the Voting Rights Coalition of Minnesota, which the League of Women Voters is a kind of a founding member of. And that group is working to kind of protect voter access and just improve our election system generally. So that's my background. Let's jump in to today's content. Kind of the overview of what happened in 2013 was a focus on some election administration issues. So the vast majority of what was proposed were really ideas that came from election administrators around the state, some of which were things that had been talked about for a long time, some that were new. There was some streamlining and updating of things, and then one significant additional step towards voter access, which is the so-called no excuse absentee voting, which I'll explain later. The context, so when the legislature showed up in the beginning of this year, kind of where were they coming from and what was the context? Well, as I'm sure you all know, there was an amendment in 2012 on the ballot relating to voting that kind of loomed large over this past session. So depending on the results of what happened last fall was going to really dictate what kinds of election law changes would be worked on, because if that amendment had passed, there would have been a need to implement that constitutional change with enacting legislation. As it happens, that amendment did fail, and in addition, there was a change in the political alignment of the House and the Senate. So that kind of set the context for walking into the session. But there was another piece to that, which is Governor Dayton has said that he wants all kind of substantive election changes to be bipartisan, to have bipartisan support. He set out that standard in, I believe, 2011 when he vetoed a statutory version of a voter ID bill. And he said, just like my predecessor, Tim Pawlenty, I want election law to have bipartisan support. So although, as you know, the DFL controls the executive and the House and the Senate, there is this kind of special category of election law that the governor has said, well, I want that to have bipartisan support. So that is a very different context compared to a lot of the other issues that the legislature is working on. And I would also say, even though we just walked into this legislative session, on the heels of the 2012 election, the 2014 election was still probably in people's minds already, as I'm sure you know. And that's going to be even more so the case this year, obviously, which clearly has an effect on which policies are heard and how they fare. All right, let me use this here. So let's review just some of the notable changes, and then I'm going to go through each of these and can ask questions as we go. So we approved no excuse absentee voting. We expanded what's called mail balloting. We lowered the threshold for taxpayer-funded recounts. There was a task force and a pilot project established on electronic poll books. And then we created some clarification for what happens when either a candidate withdraws or under what circumstances they can withdraw, or if a candidate passes away before Election Day, how we handle those situations. Those are the main items. There's a couple others that we're going to throw in there, and we're going to go through each one of these. So no excuse absentee voting. And first, I wanted to just I meant to do this at the beginning. I wanted to get a sense of the crowd. How many of you are currently or have been election judges? That's great. I knew you would be in it. That's what I expected. And how many of you have voted absentee before? Most of you. Great. Well, if that's the case, then under the law, you would need to state a reason why you're voting absentee. So I'm ill, I'm away from the precinct, I'm going to be an election judge, you have a religious objection, or religious observance that you need to be there for an election day. So that's been the process in Minnesota for as long as we've had absentee voting. The change that was made this year was to get rid of the need to state a reason why. So anybody now, when this law becomes effective, can apply for an absentee ballot and vote that way simply because they choose to. All the other current processes around absentee balloting, so what you need to fill out, and the only thing that's going to change is the application. They're going to get rid of the excuse boxes. Yeah, question?
When does it become effective?
That is the next slide. Thank you. We'll get to that in just a second. And just kind of a national look at this. This brings us closer to what a lot, 27 other states do, including all of our neighbors. They have already allowed for no excuse absentee voting. So it's, on the one hand, sort of a minor change because, frankly, we believe a lot of people did this anyway, or they weren't sure. And so this law kind of allows people the convenience to, not tell a lie, which we don't want to put voters in that situation, and we'll probably see an increase in the absentee balloting. And I know Deb later on will have something to share because here in Edina there's a high percentage of voters who are already voting absentee, and that was likely to increase. Yes, sir?
What's the cost?
Yes, Deb, I'm sure, knows way more than I do about this. I will state what I share, and Deb, if you want to jump in, that's fine, or if you want to not. Absentee ballots can be costly to process. There's lots of people involved. There's lots of eyes on it. It's different than casting a ballot on election day. There's an absentee ballot board that processes these ballots. There's the printing of the ballots. There's the mailing of them out. So there are more expenses in that. Now, as far as what the state, as far as costs associated with this legislation, well, since the counties cover the cost of elections, the city, okay. So it's the city, okay. Deb would know this. My point is, it's not that we don't have a figure for what the state will be increased spending on absentee balloting because that's done by local election officials.
It still comes back to individuals.
Absolutely, yep. And I'm sorry, Deb.
Hi, Deb Mangan and Dennis Black. Deb Mangan and Deb. Am I on?
No.
How about now?
There we go.
Deb Mangan and Edina City Clerk. The cost, there have been some differences. I believe the cost in Edina is somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 to $20 per absentee ballot. Because it is touched probably, I have a chart that I would share with you that shows all the touch points. And from the time it comes in until it actually goes into a ballot box, it's touched about 25 times. So I believe Joe Mansky says he can do it for $7 a ballot, so I probably need to find his process and trim it down. But we will probably, in 2012, we processed a little over 8,000 absentee ballots. So we anticipate that to increase for 2014. Thanks.
Thanks, Deb. And this comes up in the question of early voting, which I'll get to later. That is a process that would avoid the kind of the expense involved with absentee voting. So that's some of it, yeah. That's one of the things that's been discussed about early voting. As far as when this becomes active, it will be used for the first time in the statewide primary next August. So none of the local elections this year doesn't pertain to any of those. It doesn't pertain to any elections until the statewide primary next year. So that's when it will become effective. Other questions about no excuse absentee voting? Okay. Another area that changed was vacancies in nominations. So this again is when kind of what circumstances a candidate can withdraw their candidacy, or what happens when a candidate dies before the election and after they've been nominated or placed on the ballot. And there are a couple of kind of real life situations together cumulatively that kind of led to addressing some of these issues. One was the state Supreme Court allowed a legislative candidate up in Duluth this fall to withdraw after the withdrawal period had already ended. That kind of created a situation potentially of confusion later on, and the legislators wanted to clarify that law so that people knew exactly what circumstances they could withdraw or not. There's also a change that was made kind of based on what happened in 2002 with Senator Wellstone. So if you recall, when Senator Wellstone passed away, they went ahead with the election and had a new candidate placed on the ballot. Well, there's been a couple of federal laws that have changed since then that would kind of prohibit us from doing that again. So basically there was a concern, well, if this were to happen again, the state law isn't really going to match with the federal law, so we got to do something. What they decided to do in that situation is if a vacancy occurs within 79 days of the election, they're going to have a special election in February of the following year. So in the case of Senator Wellstone, the ballots would still be there with his name on it. Those votes would not be counted. And then a special election would occur in February to fill that seat. So that would be a different process than, again, if that situation had happened again today, they wouldn't go ahead with that election for that office. It would become a special election. There was another case down in Rochester where the city council president passed away after being placed on the ballot. And unfortunately, because of the way the state law was, even though he passed away in late June, there was no process to get his name off of the ballot in November, which was kind of a upsetting thing for the family and not a great thing for the process itself. So what they did is basically said as long as the general election ballots haven't been printed, a deceased nonpartisan candidate can be removed before that time. I was talking about this with some people, and I hadn't really understood some of the reasons why candidates, what's the purpose of the withdrawal period and why can't candidates just decide they don't want to run? And one of the things I learned was that there's been cases, for instance, in judicial races where a judge, let's say a longtime judge is running, and the judge actually plans on retiring and really wants their deputy or their protege to get that office. Well, what can happen is a judge can, say they're running for re-election, maybe nobody decides to oppose the judge because they don't think they'll have any chance. This person always gets reelected. And then let's say shortly before the election, the judge withdraws and the protege puts their name on the ballot, and then there's kind of no chance at competition. So that's some of the situation which I hadn't thought of as to why it's important to have these rules about kind of under what circumstances you can withdraw or not. And also, again, these situations where a candidate passes away, how are we going to handle those? So pretty nuanced stuff here, but important nonetheless. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Why is the third point about as long as the general election ballot hasn't been printed, a deceased nonpartisan candidate can be removed? So this implies that if it's a partisan candidate, they can't be removed. And why that distinction?
Okay, so the distinction has to do with, first of all, having a primary for partisan candidates, and also the way that the parties have a process for nominating a candidate. So even though a party can endorse a nonpartisan candidate, which they do, that's kind of different from actually nominating a candidate, which is actually part of the state law process. So for example, for a federal office, a party will nominate somebody for Senate. For something like, if you look at the mayor's race in Minneapolis, that's actually a nonpartisan race, even though parties can endorse, but that's separate. And so there's special rules that pertain to partisan offices that, for example, you want the special election to happen versus a nonpartisan where the parties don't have to weigh in. There's no requirement that the parties have that part of the process to weigh in. Does that make some sense? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Why, on the second point in there, you say we'll trigger a special election the following February. Why is the after terms already started? Why in February?
I believe that was just timing. And I should be repeating the question for the video, I'm sorry. So the question was, why is the special election being held in February as opposed to another time or sooner? This would be kind of after the primary happens, and so this is, yeah. You may, yes.
Having been an administrator for 35 years, I might have a little better hand.
I'm sure you do.
We'll see if we're on. The reason it's held in February is because we already have an election in November. That's a statewide election, and we have 87 counties and 4,000 precincts that have to then reprint ballots and get everything that happened in November has to be recorded as far as registrations. We have to get all those canvassing boards done, and it takes 10 weeks approximately for us to get ready to have an election. So that's the timing, and I realize that's longer than 10 weeks, but this then allows the parties to come up with their endorsing caucuses.
Thanks, Deb. Any others on that? No, please jump in whenever. There were a number of technical changes. One I'll mention. There used to be, how many remember the colored paper ballots for different offices? So there were pink ballots and canary ballots and all sorts of stuff. Mm-hmm. So we have done away with that. However, the statute had not reflected, so they still talked about these colored ballots. So one small change we did was get rid of all those references, and that it was peppered throughout in several places, and we're going to be getting rid of some of that stuff in the rules process too that I'll be talking about. So a little bit of streamlining. We also expanded mail balloting. Now, how many of you are familiar with mail balloting? It's different than absentee balloting. Mail balloting is conducting the whole election by mail, so people don't go into an individual precinct to vote. There will be kind of one localized location where they can do that on election day, but everybody is mailed a ballot who's registered to vote in that area, and then they mail their ballot back. This is something that actually some states have adopted statewide. So, in Washington and Oregon, they don't have polling places anymore on election day. Everybody's mailed a ballot, they mail it back. And again, there's some physical locations that people can go, but they conduct all of their elections by mail. This is something that we provide in Minnesota law for basically less densely populated areas where it doesn't make sense cost-wise to set up a precinct. It's not convenient for voters would have to go long distances anyway to get there. So kind of localized polling places really only make sense if you have a dense enough population to accommodate that. So while we've had mail balloting for I don't know how long, but it's been in law, we actually expanded mail balloting to towns of any size, also to cities with fewer than 400 registered voters. So we raised the threshold so that cities with fewer than 400, I think it maybe was 200 previous to that. And then precincts with fewer than 100 registered voters can also conduct an election by mail. The law also allows us to create a module in our statewide voter registration system to better track and process those ballots. So that'll be a new change effective. I'm actually not sure exactly when the effective date is on that. Do you know, Deb? 2014. Yeah. Any questions on mail ballots? Yes.
Is that module and the tracking, is that the security, so to speak, for mail ballot elections? Because, I mean, on absentee, you have to sign, when you go in to vote, you have to sign and it has to match and that kind of thing. How are mail ballots tracked in terms of who's actually balloting?
That's not something I'm knowledgeable about. Maybe Deb is. Deb's my new co-presenter. Thank you, Deb. No, it's fine.
Okay, right now SVRS tracks all mail-in ballots, but there's not a distinction in there that the AB is a separate from the mail ballot. So right now, from our SVRS system, which we all use to issue our absentee ballots, because if you have a mail ballot election, you don't have an in-person election. So the assumption has been that it's okay to use it, but this just creates a separate module. It's like adding another spreadsheet.
And
So
Deb, do you know what the requirements are in terms of, when you do an absentee ballot, you have to have the witness and different signatures. Do you know if that varies much?
No, that is, you know what, I'm not familiar as far as the mail balloting. I don't think you have to have the same stringent requirements that you do in the absentees, because I haven't ever conducted a mail election.
Do they know whether the mail balloting is going to be less expensive per vote?
It is not less expensive. It is not, but it is more convenient for our voters. In some places, they would have to travel quite a few miles in order to vote.
One more. Sorry, Deb.
I grew up in Oregon. I haven't lived there since the 60s, but my mom and dad continued to live there, used the mail-in ballot. I've never heard
authenticity or the reliability or anything. They liked it, and it seemed well received.
Yeah. Yeah, there's kind of out west, they've done a number of different experiments with democracies, they have a lot, kind of a different ethos. And the only states that have allowed that mail-in balloting are Oregon and Washington. I've looked at it a little bit, so there's this big question about how does that affect voter turnout? Does it increase it, doesn't it? There is some studies say one thing, some studies say another. The general sense I get from the research is it can improve turnout somewhat significantly in special and local elections, where turnout is usually quite low. But in statewide general elections, it doesn't usually have much of an impact on turnout. And that's kind of one of the questions I'm interested in as well. But and I don't know if it's controversial there or not. I think they've been doing it for a while, and it's an interesting concept. Yeah.
If this allows any town or town of any size to use mail balloting, doesn't that say that we eventually in Minnesota will just sort of mail-in balloting?
Yeah, so town here is actually being used as a technical term, so a township versus a city. So I don't know what the definition of a township is, but it is by definition small. So this is still only available to a limited number of municipalities in the state. And I don't know of anybody talking about expanding this to big cities. Yeah.
I don't think we have any townships left in the metro area.
Yes, we do.
Do we? Who do you think?
Yeah. Do we have any townships in the local area?
Naturally, I would say in Carver County, there's probably a dozen townships. Belgrade, Chaska, Carver, Lake Town, a lot of,
Those are townships, not
those are
cities?
all townships.
So Deb is saying there's a
There
number
are-
of townships. Yeah.
There are cities by the same name, but there are still townships all over.
Right. And Deb, do you know if any of those townships conduct mail ballots? They may, they may not. Yeah.
In Metro, they're all.
They're all, okay, great. All right, anything else on mail ballots? It was funny, when I was talking about this with the league, some League of Women Voters people were in the room, and I was talking about all mail balloting, and it sounds, like, no, that's M-A-I-L, okay?
Excuse me, I have some.
Yeah, yes.
The League of Women Voters has allowed members who are male since 1975.
Excellent.
Not very long, but maybe before you were born.
It was before I was born, so the league has allowed male members. I will join the league someday. So recounts, you're all familiar with recounts here in Minnesota. Another area of law that has been tweaked is lowering the threshold for what we've called an automatic recount. So this varies a little bit by race, if it's a federal race, a legislative race, but basically the threshold was reduced from 1/2 of 1% to 1/4 of 1%. So that means there needs to be a tighter margin between candidates in many offices for them to trigger an automatic recount. The other change we made is that the recount isn't technically automatic anymore. And by automatic, it was both something that would automatically happen, and these are taxpayer-funded recounts. So this is kind of recounts that are required by the law. Under this new law, the candidates have to proactively submit a letter stating that they're requesting the recount. So I think the scenario they're looking at is if a candidate basically was the losing candidate and said, well, don't bother, the state law would have still gone through with that. And this allows the candidate the option to say, yes, do please proceed, or no. So it kind of puts the onus on them to confirm it or not. This also still does not change the law which allows a candidate to request a recount as long as that candidate pays for it, him or herself. So that is still an option. Again, the state won't be paying for, or the taxpayers won't be paying for recounts unless it's this 1/4 of 1% and a candidate requests it. Yes?
How would this new rule have affected the Franklin and the Dayton recounts?
I will need some math help. I don't know what that margin would have been. I bet Deb does.
You're on.
In the 2008 election, there was only a 215 vote difference, isn't that? I believe that's what it was. So that would still have taken place because obviously there were 1.9 million ballots cast. 2.9, thank you. And in the 2012 election, I believe there was approximately a 12,000 vote difference, which would not have triggered a recount if we were at 0.25%.
Thank you. Any other questions on recounts? All right.
People participating in a bunch of recounts.
Yeah, how many of you have done recounts either locally or with some of those? Yeah, interesting. I just read the account of the 2008, This Is Not Florida. I don't know if any of you read that book by a former MinPost author, so I was just brushing up on all that interesting period. So another area here is loss, kind of around the loss and restoration of voting rights for individuals who have been convicted of a felony. Just a little bit of context on this if you're not familiar with this area of law. States decide who are eligible to vote with a couple of federal musts or guidelines, but the states can state who is eligible to vote. And so the states can decide for themselves if somebody with a felony conviction has their right to vote removed, and if that is removed temporarily or permanently. So we have a kind of a hodgepodge of laws in the country. Some states, for example, in Maine, you can actually continue to vote while you're incarcerated. So I guess they do absentee ballots there. Some states, in some states like in Florida, you essentially can never vote again. And there's some states where there's a process, but it's very difficult. In some states, you have to proactively petition the governor to get that right restored. In other states like Minnesota, there's kind of an automatic restoration of rights after a certain period. And in Minnesota, that period is after the completion of your probation and your parole. So that's some of the background to it. The reason that context is important is because there's not a lot of clarity nationally, there's a lot of confusion by the public, sometimes even by probation officers as to what the status is. So you end up with two kinds of unfortunate scenarios. One, you may end up with people voting who aren't allowed to vote, and two, you may end up with people not voting who are allowed to vote and thinking, well, I can't vote. So we get both scenarios. Another piece of context is the way that our judicial system is set up, where there's many local and county entities involved with this. There is no coordinated, uniform way of notifying somebody who's been convicted of a felony when their right was taken away and when it was restored. So basically, it's a point of confusion for a lot of people. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little later on in terms of what may happen in 2014 or issues that they may look at, because there was a task force, again, I'll come back to it, that did a kind of a comprehensive overview of this issue and came up with some recommendations. As far as what passed this session, two pieces. There's going to be increased data sharing between corrections and our office. The OSS is the Office of the Secretary of State. That will allow us, I think, more frequent and up-to-date information about the status of voters so that we have that information. And before the law change, we needed the statutory authority to get that data. It also changes who is in charge of investigating voting violations from the county attorney's office to law enforcement agencies. So previously, the county attorney would be investigating all those violations. Under this new law enforcement agencies will be handling that.
Here, our cost, our investigation.
So, right, so local law enforcement. All right. Any questions on that? We'll come back to this topic, but. Okay, another change that happened was a reduction in the vouching rules. Excuse me. So vouching, again, as most of you probably know, is the process whereby if on election day a voter wants to register and they don't have the necessary proof of residence documents, they can bring another registered voter from their precinct who will sign a sworn statement saying, yes, this voter, I know this voter, and this voter lives in this precinct and is eligible to vote. When this law was passed in, I believe, 72, there was no guidelines as to how many voters a person could vouch for. In 2006, they for 3? Oh, I'm sorry. So when it was originally passed, it was vouched for 3. And do you know when they got rid of that? Okay, so sometime in the 80s, they got rid of a limit for how many you could vouch for. Then in 2006, they set a limit of 15. And now, in 2012, they've brought it down from 15 to 8. So in other words, you could vouch for 8 other people if you knew that they lived in your precinct and were helping them register on election day. This doesn't affect residential facility vouching, where a nursing home, a shelter, something like that. There's a process whereby those employees can vouch for a resident of those facilities, and there's no limit. They can vouch for any and all of their residents that are eligible to vote. So this does not affect that issue. Any questions on the vouching? All right, we're moving right along. Electronic rosters. How many of you have been following this, electronic rosters? Okay. What is an electronic roster? It's just an electronic version of the paper roster. So instead of having at your polling place the list of all the voters on a piece of paper, you have it on an electronic tablet. There can be a couple of benefits to this. If you are able to input that data on site electronically and track who showed up and who didn't electronically, that saves a lot of data entry down the road, where, as Deb said, it takes a long time to process the election day registrations. It takes a long time to process. You got to check out who, this voter came, this voter didn't, and add all that. Well, if you did that electronically, that would save them a lot of time. It would also could have the effect of saving some time for voters themselves. So instead of me filling out my application, and maybe that multiplies to the point where there's a long line, if there's a lot of same-day registrants, if you have an ID, you could swipe it in, it would populate your data, and you could maybe move the process along a little more quickly. So this is something that the state is investigating as an option, and they're doing this through 2 means. One is a task force that was established under this new legislation that will examine this issue. It's a 15-member board. They met for the first time in July. These are all public meetings. In fact, there's one happening today. And I do encourage you to check those out if you're interested. This is the kind of the scope of what they're going to be looking at. They're going to be looking just at the electronic roster technology, the data security, kind of the reliability of data from other state departments that may be needed if you're going to do same-day registration or get kind of other data that you need for your voter list. They're going to look at using a photograph with the roster and the ability of precincts to connect to an electronic roster. So, one of the real challenges with technology in the polling places, we have all in any manner of polling place across the state that have different technological capabilities on site, and some hardly have electricity, and some certainly don't have reliable internet or network connections, so there's a lot of issues there. And they're also going to look at the cost. So would this save money? How much would it save? What would be required to spend on implementing this technology? And they're going to synthesize all that and put it in a report due to the legislature in January. So that's one piece of it, is this task force. The other piece is an actual pilot project that's being run for this fall's municipal elections. Now, these 5 municipalities, Dilworth, Minnetonka, Moorhead, St. Anthony, St. Paul, were volunteered to utilize these electronic rosters in some of their precincts for this fall's election. And so they're going to be working with a variety of vendors with kind of different versions of the same concept. They're going to, and those vendors are providing this free. I think it's like they hope that they'll get a contract down the road. And they're going to test this out, see what works, what doesn't, and report that back in January as well. And some of these will, they're hoping to have the ability to do like the data scan on with your card. There will be paper backups on site during the pilot project, so in case anything goes wrong, they'll have the paper backups. Yes?
If you don't have a photo ID, same-day registration, are they going to take your photo?
That's one of the questions that they're looking at is photos in general. Now, this task force has nothing to do with whether you're required to have a photo or not to register to vote. This is looking at feasibility of can we, for instance, take photos from the Department of Vehicle Services and input them into this system. Also, can you take a photo on election day and put it into the system? That was one of the ideas proposed during the constitutional amendment debate. So again, this task force very much, the outcome of that may inform that discussion down the road, and I'm sure will, but they're not making policy recommendations as to whether it should be a requirement or not. It's more of looking at the technology behind it. Yes?
Are there any states who use a system, anything like this?
There are states that use electronic rosters, yes. I don't know if any states import photos or not, but definitely electronic rosters are used in other places. Yeah.
For the electronic use, are they going to be using an iPad or tablets with the little square? Because people use that when you get your hair cut.
The QR code or?
No, they have, iPads have a little card reader that you can attach to.
Oh, I see what you're saying, right. So the question was like, will you have a barcode that you could use with your iPad, basically? Right.
They don't know yet what they're going to do. They're looking at possibilities. It could be laptops, it could be tablets. They don't have a decision. They're just looking at it.
But, so on these pilot projects, they might be using all different kinds of electronic.
Correct.
Yes, and that's, the question was that they're using all different types of devices, and that is correct, and that's part of the point is to test different products, test different vendors, see which ones are reliable, which ones work the best. So,
Will they all, those electronic devices all have access to the Secretary of State's data file?
no, these are basically just the paper put on a device, which means they're not directly connected into any system. The task force is looking at okay, could we connect? But this is simply, uploading it as a file and walking away with it and having that there instead. So it's not a direct connection to any live database. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other questions on the pilot project? All right, we are moving right along here. We're coming up to 2014. What is ahead of us? The governor has called for an unsession. I don't know if you've been hearing about this, but basically he's made a call for the legislature to really focus on eliminating unnecessary or redundant laws, rules, and regulations. So that's how the governor has framed this next session primarily. It will be a short session year. It's the second year of the biennium. There won't be, assuming we don't have any major unexpected budget shortfalls, there won't be any major budget decisions to be made this year. So the context being it's a short session, plus the 2014 election season is upon us, will put a lot of pressure for them to not linger, and depending on the issue, maybe not act on things that they, legislators do or don't want to have as part of the election debate in 2014. So that's definitely going to be very much on people's minds. We are doing something that's connected to lawmaking, but a step removed, which is the rulemaking process. So rules have the effect of statute. So we have election statutes and we have election rules. And those rules govern a variety of different topics. For example, it sets out, what the registration application form looks like for voter registration. It governs a lot of the more details of the law and stuff that you don't necessarily want to have in your statute, but things that we want codified. Rules have the same effect as statute, although they're subject to statute, so they're not as high in terms of their authority. An administrative law judge is somebody who approves proposed rules, and so there's a whole process spelled out in law for how this rulemaking process goes. Well, we are going through that process right now at our office and over the next couple months. And the public will have an opportunity to comment on the rules that are proposed. There will be hearings likely, so it's kind of a back and forth with the public and with this administrative law judge to oversee the process. We intend to have draft rules available to the public by the end of this month, so you'll be seeing some things from our office fairly shortly that will detail, here are the things that we're looking at proposing as new rules. And it's not a process that I'm working on. I don't have a really good sense of exactly what's going to come out of that. But again, I do encourage you all when that comes out, and this stuff can be quite technical, although I'm sure you all are up to it. But you know, we want good public feedback on the rules that are being proposed, and especially as they affect kind of a voter's experience. A lot of this has to do with some administration things that maybe the voter never comes in contact with very directly. But they're very important nonetheless. So that'll be going on during the next couple months and into the next session likely. I wanted to have a brief conversation about early voting. So early voting is different from absentee voting. It's similar in that you're casting your ballot and sending it early. But early voting really refers to going in person to a physical location and putting your ballot into the ballot box, just like on election day. So we already heard, you know, some of the high costs associated with absentee balloting. Well, there's costs associated with early voting, but if you had a lot of people do that instead of absentee balloting, it may and probably would provide potentially significant savings for local election officials. And I know Deb has spoken about this issue as well. It was considered last year by the legislature. It did not pass. And there were, you know, in the hearings that I went to, a number of local elected officials who spoke out in favor of it, seeing it as a preferable kind of election administration option for processing early votes as opposed to absentee voting. One note on the no excuse. So are you kind of getting at, well, if we're letting all these people vote without an excuse, is this going to really raise the cost of elections? Well, most states that have, and in fact, I think all, if not, you know, it'd be very close if not all, states that allow people to vote without an excuse also have early voting. So those policies typically have gone together in other states, and that may be one thing that helps alleviate costs of absentee balloting. So the proposal last year, I think it was a 10-day voting period. I may have that off by a couple days, but it would be, you know, within 2 weeks before the election, people could go to locations. What would those locations be? Well, under that law, it was basically any site that is processing absentee ballots in person. So I'm sure the City Hall here would be one of those places that people could go. And they could go in person and cast that ballot. So that policy didn't pass. There's still a desire for that policy among many, I believe, election officials. Also, our office has been an advocate of looking at this. And so this may or may not be a topic next year. Again, as it's a shorter session, there may be less of a desire for taking up issues, and this is one that kind of falls into the controversial category. So we will see what happens there. But I know the League is working on this issue, and we're working with it as well to see what can be done. Yes?
Is there a provision in this ordinarily for you to go to the polls if you've already voted early and they would eliminate your early vote? No.
There's no way of doing it. Once a ballot's in the box, you don't know whose ballot is whose.
Right.
So the question was, can you,
Okay.
if you vote early, can you?
Distinct from absentee balloting.
Correct. With absentee balloting, you can, I don't know up to what point, but you can say, no, I'm going to vote. Like, you can withdraw your ballot somehow. I don't know the process for that, but yeah, with early voting, you would have voted, and that would be it. Yes.
What are the objections to?
The objections to early voting. There's been some objections to, so some of the voices I heard during this debate, if you are concerned about election day registration, there are some who don't want election day registration to happen combined with early voting for some of the same concerns that they have raised in the past about verifying voters, things like that. I think there's also a sense among some that we don't need it. You know, our system works. But, you know, what I'm not saying, that you'll probably all know, is there's a political dimension to this debate that I will let you all explore on your own time. But, you know,
I'll have to take that to your elected officials and ask them, because he's tap dancing.
yeah.
No, I understand, but I just don't understand why that would affect what's that? Yeah.
Well, and I can say, you know, there's, in kind of the political campaign realm, there's a perception that I've read about that absentee balloting favors kind of Republican voters, or rather that Republican voters tend to avail themselves more of absentee balloting. Democrat voters tend to avail themselves more of early voting. I don't know, I can't verify those statements. That is kind of the common knowledge, and I think that drives a lot of the political dimensions of this. Yes?
I have a question about the mail-in voting. Well, is it going to be done by postmark? How do you, whether it's eligible to be counted or not?
And I'm sorry, you're speaking about mail-in ballots or absentee?
Not absentee, the mail-in.
And your question is if
Well,
there's,
will you go by postmark of the mail? How will you count it?
right, so it's like absentee ballots in that they have to be received. So for instance, absentee ballots have to be received by the last mail delivery on election day. And if that's what you're asking, the same thing for mail ballots. They need to be,
It has to be received.
yes,
If it was postmarked,
it's got to be
does it make
received.
any difference if it was the post office's fault? It doesn't matter.
Right, it's the voters, right, the voters has to ensure and plan for getting it there by the last delivery on election day.
They get mailed out 30 or 45 days before an election.
Okay.
So there's more than enough time for them to get them back in time to have them in.
All right.
Right, sir.
Well, and the voter's responsibility to get the ballot back, they don't have to mail it back. They can bring it themselves, they can.
Right.
Correct.
So you're just clarifying, a voter can deliver it in person if they so choose. That's right.
It's up to the voter to see to it that they get their ballot in on time.
That's correct, yes.
Do you know how many states have early voting?
I will blank on the number. It's definitely more than a third. I think about 30. Yeah.
For some reason, 27 comes
Debbie's
to my head,
nodding
but
her head,
I
yeah.
don't know.
Somewhere in the high 20s, low 30s. So it is, and the way it's used varies. So some, I believe one state, it's kind of a whole month before election. In other states, it's a 2-week period, it's a week period. So, and then it also varies significantly as to where these early voting locations are. So under the Minnesota proposal that was considered last year, it would be kind of wherever you can go in person. So right now you can go in person to cast an absentee ballot. That's an option for locales that process those. This would provide early voting just in those locations. So in some states, they have kind of voting centers. Could be at a mall, could be at a business, could be at a church. And the proposal last year did not include or look at any of those other locations. So there's a lot of states that use it, but the practices and the implementation varies quite a bit. Yes.
You know, Texas does roving polling places.
Right.
They'll move to one place for 3 days, they'll go to another place for 3 days.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Texas has kind of mobile early voting units.
It's
Yeah.
interesting to watch because you end up with campaigning people outside with signs and you know there's a polling place. And then 2 days later, you see another place that's got it going.
Campaigns just follow it. Yeah. I'm sorry?
I was wondering, sir, just asked the question, or made the comment, how would voters keep track in Texas of where they're supposed to vote?
Twitter. The media.
Media, it's publicized.
Yeah. Right.
Well, you've got the same situation here. If you come to City Hall to vote in a early voting scenario,
Mm-hmm.
and you live in Edina, you may be in one of a couple different districts. So we'll have an issue of how you handle those ballots would be a
Well,
concern.
we do it right now.
Yeah, right,
We have ballots that are unique for each precinct.
right.
Doesn't matter. We have to issue that ballot correctly to that person.
Well, exactly, but what I'm saying is if you come here to vote on early voting, for example,
Same
you
thing.
need to have 2 machines.
No, no, I don't. The machine can be programmed to handle 100 precincts,
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
so,
Okay. Then you can just use 1 machine.
right.
Very good.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Other questions about early voting? Yeah. Okay. Coming back to this topic, voters with a felony conviction. Now, I alluded to and want to explain a little bit more. When the governor vetoed the 2011 statutory version of the voter ID bill that became, or parts of that became in that amendment, the governor called for an election integrity task force to look at election integrity. And in particular, there have been instances of voters who've had a felony casting a ballot. And so looking at, okay, what can be done about the situation? What are some things we can do to either clarify law or improve this process? So that task force came out with an interesting report I encourage you to look at of a number of recommendations, some of which I'll touch on. There was significant but not unanimous support within the task force for implementing what we call here the North Dakota model. Now, North Dakota is one of the states that allows people's votes to be automatically restored immediately upon release from incarceration. The benefit to this is, for one, it's very clear that if you're standing here in front of me, not incarcerated, that even if you had a criminal conviction, you are eligible to vote as long as you meet the other qualifications. So it kind of clarifies that. You don't have the same problem where, okay, am I still on probation or parole? That it also provides those voters an opportunity to participate. Voting is a kind of a pro-social behavior. I think it shows some level of maturity, some level of interest in something beyond yourself and in your community. And so there are many who feel, well, this is exactly the type, we want these people to find jobs. We want them to be integrated in the community. And voting is one other way where they can kind of take responsibility for themselves and hopefully be contributing members of society. Not a view that everybody shares, but that's definitely a view among people who want this right to be restored upon release from incarceration. So that proposal was considered kind of briefly last year, and it did not get implemented. Another area that this task force looked at was notification. So not only do people not really know, or because of this confusion, but the state doesn't have any uniform process for notifying people, to even let them know, hey, your right is, you don't have your right to vote, it'll be restored at X, Y, Z time, or you do have your right restored so you can vote. That there was considerable discussion about this notification process that did not end up being included in the bill. So now the current law stands where there's not a uniform way for our criminal justice system to be notifying voters of what their situation is. In my understanding, so when a voter, when somebody is placed in incarceration, they're told different things about what their rights are or are not, and oftentimes this is not something that is included in the list of you won't be able to vote. So there may not be any instruction or awareness on the part of that individual apart from them having to go investigate it as to what the rule is regarding them.
I think also sometimes, Jeff, there is a confusion on the part of even a parole officer.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's sometimes, because sometimes court orders an extremely long term of probation.
Yes.
And sometimes those people do then not have to see their parole officer during that probationary time. There are sometimes 20 to 25-year probationary periods.
Yeah. So Deb was talking about sometimes the probation officers aren't aware. Our advice is often, never register unless you're sure, never vote unless you're sure. Contact, your probation officer who ideally would be able to help them. They don't always know. And also, Deb's exactly right about the probation. Now, Minnesota has a lower incarceration rate because we rely on these ultimate probationary periods, sometimes end up being quite lengthy. And so sometimes voters, so for instance, I understand a lot of drunk driving cases can be handled through probation sometimes rather than incarceration. And some of those people may not realize. I mean, I think some people think, well, if I haven't gone to prison, then maybe I don't have a felony conviction. Or these legal categories, they're not always clear to people how it pertains to them. So that's right. There's not one reliable place where people can get this information. And when you get into the weeds, there can be very complex things that I can't even relay to you about, different types of basically statuses that you can fall under in the criminal justice system that would make this a hard thing to understand. But the notification did not get included in this year's bill. There was also one of the recommendations that was proposed but did not pass would have been reducing the penalty for registering to vote if you've had a felony conviction. So currently, both registering to vote with intention, so you need to know that you did it and you weren't allowed to, is a felony itself. And likewise, voting, well, with the intention to do so when you knew you weren't eligible, is a felony itself too. So you could kind of have somebody who registers and then votes, and that would be kind of 2 felony convictions that would send them right back in potentially. And there was a proposal to kind of have this off-ramp, so to speak, where it's like, okay, well, you registered to vote. We're telling you that you're not eligible. You have X number of days to withdraw. And there was kind of a proposal to set up this process. They could contest it and say, well, I think I am eligible. And then they could kind of avoid that. And if they're convicted, that could be a misdemeanor rather than a felony. So again, these are all things that came out of the Election Integrity Task Force. There's some other items included in there that are quite interesting. This is probably an issue that it may have a harder time in this year's session, given the kind of the politics of this. But I can tell you there's a lot of community interest in this. If any of you are familiar with the so-called ban the box legislation that passed last year, that's a law that said on a first-time job application, like basically the first interaction between an applicant and an employer, you're no longer allowed to have a checkbox to say, if you had a felony conviction or a criminal conviction. You can still ask that, but it has to be later down the road. And the idea here was to give some of these people who, we as a society want to be working, who find an extremely hard time getting a job, because today you get so many applications, people can just set aside the ones with the criminal conviction. Doesn't matter what it was about, how long ago, whatever. We're just not going to deal with you. And now that law has changed so that the employer still absolutely can get that information, but it would be, if they are interested in this candidate and they call them back from an interview or at some other point in that process, that information comes out then. I raise that because that passed with a lot of bipartisan support this past year, and there's some kind of similarities to this issue, and maybe some of the same proponents of that issue may be coming together to work on this. Questions or anything on this topic of law? I think we're getting close, yes. One other note, so you all remember, of course, in last fall's presidential with Superstorm Sandy, really threw the election in places like New Jersey and New York into chaos. And our office is looking at both kind of legislative and extra legislative ways to look at these scenarios and plan, okay, what would we do in this situation to make sure that the election could still go forward in an orderly way, that voters could participate, all that stuff. And I'm not familiar with the details of what that kind of plan would look like, but I am told this is something that our office is investigating and wants to have a plan eventually put in place so that we're ready for those kinds of emergencies that we do not foresee. That was the scope of what I wanted to talk about for 2014. Are there things that I didn't cover either for what happened last fall or what may happen that people wanted to discuss any further? Had questions on? Yes, sir.
Do you see any strong momentum for ranked choice voting statewide?
So that was another issue that the legislature did consider. So just some quick background that right now only charter cities, home rule cities that set their own have some greater independence than the rest of cities, they can decide that they want to implement ranked choice voting if they follow whatever process they have to do that. So that's why Minneapolis and St. Paul can do it. Now, if you're not a home rule charter city, you cannot just decide, well, we want to vote through this method. So the legislation that, that he was referring to would allow kind of any, I guess, any municipality that wanted to adopt this method to go ahead and do so. That was heard in committee and did not ultimately pass. I know that you know, the group Fair Vote Minnesota that's been working on this issue for a long time. I'm sure we'll still be working on it, but you know, I won't guess as to what will happen. But all I can say is it hasn't happened yet. Yes.
Could you briefly describe that process, what the gentleman is referring to?
Ranked choice voting?
Yes.
Yeah, so ranked choice voting is a method that they're now using in Minneapolis and St. Paul to conduct their local elections. And it allows voters to rank candidates in order of preference. Yes. So in St. Paul, you can rank up to 6. In Minneapolis, you can rank up to 3. You don't have to rank if you don't want to. If your top choice candidate does not get 50% plus 1 of the vote, then your votes are reallocated to your second choice. And all of these votes are kind of, there's kind of this continual counting process until somebody gets that 50% plus 1 of the votes. It's a very complex topic with lots of strong viewpoints on all sides. Yes?
I do not have an opinion about whether or not ranked choice voting should be implemented, but I do think, as what Jeff just said, in St. Paul you rank up to 6, in Minneapolis you rank up to 3. There are also a variety of ways that the ranked votes are counted. So I think if they're looking at this, that we need to have a statewide standard, so that if you are ranking your ballots, everybody understands what's happening, because I don't think that's the case right now.
Right. I'm a somewhat intelligent person, and I do not understand the counting method, particularly for multi-member districts, so where you're choosing up to 3 candidates and you're ranking all of that. The counting there is extremely complex, and I have a hard time following it.
One candidate can end up losing in the first iteration.
There's all sorts of scenarios that can occur. So, yeah, I think that's a great point, Deb, about a kind of a uniform standard on that. What other things are people interested in hearing about, if anything, or comments or questions?
Well,
Debbie and Kay? And I do want to hand things over. If Deb wants to talk a little bit about the machine, or, yeah.
thank you so very much.
Thank you.
You just, it's intriguing. You made it even more intriguing for us
Good.
all. And yes, and Deb is going to do some show and tell, I
Great.
understand.
Take it away.
Deb Mangan, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'll just add my 2 cents that I'm very appreciative of Secretary Ritchie and the office. They have been very collaborative and working with election administrators throughout the state so that we're all more consistent. I think some of you I know were election judges, absentee judges. You were there in 2008, you were there in 2012, and you know we're really working for a statewide consistency, that we all do things in the same way. Minnesota has kind of a proud heritage there, and I think we can all be proud of that. You, as I've told you before, are some of the best judges in the state. Hennepin County has purchased new election equipment, and we will be instituting that this November. We are now using the ES&S Model 200, which is a digital optical scan voting equipment, as opposed to what we used before, which was an optical scan equipment that just scanned where it is. Now, every ballot that goes through is digitized. So you could capture on the memory stick. Again, we used to have the capability of programming up to 10 precincts on a memory stick. I don't know the absolute number of precincts that can be programmed, but it can be, I believe, more than 100. So we could have the entire county programmed on one memory stick. That way, when it would identify through timing marks what ballot it is. For anyone that would like to come up, I have a pen I borrowed. I walked down without pens. I can't believe that. I have some test ballots, and I invite you to come up and go ahead, just so you see the process. You see that if you see it, it welcomes you to insert your ballot. There's a much larger screen. Tells you what it's doing, that it's scanning. And you get a message, thank you for voting, your ballot has been counted. So that it's just a little different process. If you would like to come up, I would just invite you to do that, to play with it and see. You can mess the ballot up and see what message you get. So, yes.
What if you make a mistake on your ballot? How can you correct it?
Okay. I'm voting for both a BMW and a Honda. Okay, this is probably too small for you to see, but it says, you filled too many ovals in one contest. The votes will not count. In the contest for best automobile manufacturer, you chose 2 candidates and you are allowed 1. You can return your ballot or you can cast your ballot. And for those of you that are election judges, you will recall that the voter makes the decision and the election judge pushes the button. Now that will be a little challenging, but that's how you would do it. And your question is?
What if you have the right number of votes, but you voted for the person you didn't want to?
Well, you should notice that before you put it in. And as in the past, the ballot counter is not going to know you didn't make that choice. But if you understand that, as you have always been able to do, that would be considered a spoiled ballot. And you walk back to the ballot judge and you say, I would like a different ballot. They put that into an envelope and issue you a new ballot. So this one we would simply return.
And then you would take it back to the table.
Right. Well, it quickly gave you a message that said your ballot was not cast, either reinserted or return it and talk to an election. Super. Yes, Andy. Correct. 22 months. Yes. Right. Right. All right. If anybody'd like to come up, I will be happy to stay here or.
So who paid for these machines?
Hennepin County paid for the purchase of the machines. The city of Edina leases them on an ongoing basis, and that we pay for insurance, storage, and programming. Oh, thanks, Jeff. Folks, in Edina, we have typically in the last general elections, approximately 20% or more of the people that vote in Edina vote by absentee ballot. In 2012, we had approximately 32,000 people vote, and we issued right around 8,300 absentee ballots. We anticipate in 2014 to see an increase. I don't know how much. Because, quite frankly, I don't know that everybody that voted by absentee ballot was really gone. We are not the excuse police, so we never looked into that. But we anticipate if you may vote by absentee ballot, you will take advantage of that. I would guess that we may see 10,000 absentee ballots. Yes? They can do that right now. We're open 45 days before an election. So we literally, I would just say, we have jokingly said for some of the people that have worked for me in the absentee room that sometimes we have the RVs rounded up in front of City Hall the day that we open to vote. Personally, I believe that the increased, the savings that we would see in an absentee ballot, it's two-pronged for me. Initially, a voter gets to know that they haven't made a mistake that they can correct on their ballot. So that gives them the same opportunity that in-person voters have. Additionally, because that ballot now goes through there, we'll have a chain of custody of those ballots. They will be kept in safekeeping on a daily basis. They'll be removed, they'll be sealed, they'll be signed for. We can account for what happens to them on a daily basis. Right now, if you vote by absentee ballot, you seal your ballot up and put it into a privacy envelope. Then that privacy envelope is slid inside of your number 2 envelope, which has your name, your witness name, and everything on it. That's a fairly arduous process for those of you that have ever been an absentee ballot judge on election day. We then can do the processing of that. That means we have to slit all the envelopes open, we have to take them out, we have to flatten them. Sometimes I'll text one of you my picture of 2012. Mary, do you remember that? I had the Public Works Department cut me pieces of plywood and brought me bricks, and we had flattened ballots in a room under bricks before we started tabulating them to try and get them flattened out to increase the accuracy so that they were flatter when they went through the ballot counter. I know that sounds crazy, but that's how it is. When you early vote, there's no envelope. You come into City Hall, you get the same ballot. I mean, literally, if you're absentee in person or early, you get the same ballot. You fill it out, you sign in, we still record that in the system. We would still mark the roster. After a certain period of time, rosters are produced, so we'd have to keep track of that and mark that in the roster. But you put your ballot in there. There's no envelope. So all of that human time of safekeeping alphabetical ballots, and we have literally boxes of them. Right, right. Mary, you had a question? Okay, thanks.
Jeff, for speaking to us today. This was really informative. And Deb, thank you for bringing the machine. I appreciate all of your coming today. If you'll take a flyer on the way out of the room, it has our upcoming programs, not just the tour of the Bear House on Sunday, but also the School Board Candidate Forum on September 24th. There are 9 candidates running for 4 positions on the school board, and that program will be right here at 7 p.m. And our October unit meetings on October 10th at the library and the 12th here at City Hall will be on the issue of whether Edina should consider organized trash hauling. So thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Jeff, it's really great.
Oh, yes, hi, Gwen. Nice to meet you.